My name is Archer Christian Burke, and I'm named for my uncle, Archer Christian, who was killed playing football for the University of Virginia.
We're standing here on the site of the football field at Georgetown University in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was here, early November 1909, that Georgetown and Virginia met again on the 20th anniversary of their first meeting.
Now, going into the game, UVA is the powerhouse team of the South. National press is covering this game. Over 600 UVA fans get on the trains and travel up to DC. Not only go to the game, but to lead a huge parade in Washington.
Archer Christian was a freshman. In that game in 1909, Archer Christian was having the very best game of his career.
Apparently, he had a really good first half of that game against Georgetown.
Yeah, Christian's sort of patented move in those days was to turn his back and leap. It's kind of a dangerous thing to do, particularly in those days.
I think he would jump in the air, try to get over the defender or something of that sort.
And he was known for his patented somersaulting leap, where he would catapult himself into the air and leap backwards to gain additional yardage. Toward the end of the game, he took off on one of his runs, and he was attacked by a mass of Georgetown players, and he went down in a heap.
And when they unpiled the players, Archer Christian was lying motionless on the ground.
In fact, it could have been on this very spot that this tragic occurrence happened. Christian was down. People from both Georgetown and UVA were huddling over him.
The trainer came out. Christian became conscious briefly.
Christian at one point said, "Doc, I'm really hurting, Doc," as he leaned over the stricken player.
He said, "Did you see they stepped on my face?" Then he lost consciousness.
Archer Christian's mother, for some reason, had come to Washington, but sensing some premonition, having a premonition that something might go wrong, she had not come to the game itself, but had stayed downtown at a Washington hotel, praying that everything would go well for her son Archer.
She thought something was going to happen, and she told everybody she was in the hotel, which that is just a dramatic story. So then they took him to the hospital, and they couldn't do a thing about him. It was too late. I mean, it was just horrible, but I sort of related to all these young men who go off and give their lives to their country. He gave his life for his college.
That death really created a national sensation. It was the front page story on the New York Times, for instance, that next morning.
The death of Archer Christian set the scene for a revolution in college athletics, because the cry came up around the country that college football is too dangerous.
President Alderman was determined to do something, to save a sport that he truly loved.
5 days after the incident, John Mosby, a former Confederate general and UVA alumnus, wrote a scathing letter to President Alderman on what he called the murder of Archer Christian.
The very fact that a university surgeon went with the team shows that they knew they were going to war. John S. Mosby.
The country was outraged. Politicians had legislation to ban football, to make it a crime in America to play the game of football. So, in reaction, President Alderman gets on a train with William Lambeth, and they head up to New York to meet with all the other presidents of all the other major schools. And all these guys get in a room, and they realize they've got a problem. And in that room, at that moment, President Alderman stands up, and he makes an impassioned speech to save football in America. These kids are dying, and we cannot stand by and watch this continue to happen. We've got to change the rules. We've got to make this a safer sport, and we have to think differently about how we're doing it, and we've got to play this game differently and truly make it American football.
The New York Times wrote that Alderman's speech had a noticeable effect on those in attendance. One college president immediately wrote Walter Camp, still a member of the Rules Committee, to warn him that they had a daunting task ahead of them.
Football in those early days was just a brutal sport. And there was a lot of pushing and pulling of running backs or quarterbacks. You weren't really down until you couldn't move. You could pile on.
The forward pass was difficult. At one time, there was a 15-yard penalty for an incompleted pass. So passes were discouraged.
So these guys agree that what they're going to do is they're going to create a new rules committee. And William Lambeth from the University of Virginia is appointed to this committee. And also serving on this committee is Walter Camp, the father of American football. And it's the job of these guys to figure out how we're going to play this game differently so that these kids aren't killed.
And particularly lighter players, particularly players that were fatigued and were susceptible to injuries.
Up until then, the game had been played like soccer. There were 2 long halves. And there were no substitutions. If you went out of the game because you were hurt or tired, you didn't come back in. So you were encouraged and behooved to stay in the game no matter what.
Dear Mr. Camp, I am anxious to eliminate all danger as far as possible from football. The 2 deaths I have seen in the game were due to exhaustion. Could not the game be divided into 4 quarters? William Lambeth, November 20th, 1909.
The Rules Committee, meeting on an almost monthly basis, made some very important changes.
Over the next several months, this group of rule makers would become one of the most innovative in history. Several ideas were suggested, but did not pass the vote, such as awarding a point for every first down and requiring a receiver to touch the ball to the ground after catching it. Camp asked Lambeth to take UVA's team during spring practice and experiment with other rules. Now, after substitutions, players could return to the game. 7 men would be required on the line during the snap. Players could no longer push and pull the ball carrier, and the forward pass could now be made across the line of scrimmage. Under Lambeth's watch, on the grounds of the university, a new version of American football, divided into 4 quarters, was played for the first time in history.
As a result, strategy and planning became a lot more important in football than just big guys knocking down the other guys.
The results of the rules were very quickly felt. It not only made the sport more interesting, but it certainly made the sport much more safe. The number of deaths plummeted within the next year.
What's amazing to think about is that rule that really took shape on the playing field here at the University of Virginia is now how football is played from Pop Warner leagues all the way up to the National Football League. That is American football.
So in a larger perspective, the tragedy of Archer Christian on this field in that early Saturday day in November of 1909, probably in the long run, certainly in the long run, saved lives, and one could argue that it saved college football.
That would have helped. I hope my grandmother felt that way, that it wasn't for naught, that he did help the game of football by his death.